It doesn't matter, really. And if someone would find Matt Chase,
He was just here.
yeah, it's the story of his life. Got it? Ah, here he is.
Yeah, there he goes.
And there he goes.
We're starting, Matt.
It's his home, we
That's
can't
true.
complain, right?
That's true. Let's go and clean the kitchen.
Thanks, Matt. Well, thanks everyone for regathering. I'm really looking forward to this session. And this session is intended basically to try to address the issues you all very much care about. And that is there a research design or is there a research question that could be interrogated that truly could change the field of practice, that truly could matter for rural people and families, that absent it would not be as effectively addressed in either the public, private, or philanthropic sector. Just want to indicate we have an absolutely stellar panel today, which we're very grateful for their time. I think these are four visionaries in the field. And what we tried to do was create an exchange between four very different sectors. We have the philanthropic sector, we have the NGO poverty practice sector, we have the local government sector, and we have an emerging sector a lot of us think hold great promise, and that is the cooperative opportunities to address these challenges. Very honestly, the Vitas are in your book. You might want to read them if you go through them. These are dear friends who work every day in this area, and I'd like to give them the full time to simply share a couple things. What's their current organizational perspective or their program dynamic that's evolving about poverty and poverty amelioration? And secondly, what are the questions emanating from that this field of research and policy analytics might address? And I'm going to suggest we just go down the line. Doug, if you would not mind kicking it off. Let's welcome this panel, first of all.
I can talk. Can you hear me? Or do I need to use that?
You need the mic,
Okay,
yeah.
I need the mic. All right.
All right, yes, there it is. Thank you, Chuck. It's really good to be here for lots of reasons. I do want to thank Chuck and the other main sponsors, Annie and Casey, USDA, the folks everywhere here for having the foresight and the vision to support RUPRI, particularly NACO for hosting it. This is such a critical issue. Many of you in this room, one of the reasons it's great to be here is that I've been walking down this road a bit with some of you, and it's so good to see the leaders in the field here. To be candid, it's even better to see a bunch of new folks who are committed to this work. It's so important for the future of rural places and indeed, as I'm sure people have talked about, to the United States in general. So I want to be really brief because I want to get to the conversation and I want to hear my colleagues here. So now I'm at the National Cooperative Business Association, which is an umbrella group for all kinds of co-ops, everything from the rural electrics and big agriculture co-ops, credit unions, food co-ops, worker co-ops, housing co-ops, student housing co-ops, etc. We've been around for about 102 years, and it's a business model I'm sure to many of you is quite familiar, to some maybe not quite as familiar. You know, basically it's a type of business that prefers people, that empowers people in the form of control, ownership, and benefit. And the way that it does it, very simply, is that each person that's part of that cooperative, they need to use that business, and each person has an equal say in the big questions about that business. So it's small d democratic, corporation in one way. There's a lot of ways that you can talk about co-ops. Co-ops have been used in rural places, of course, in agriculture co-ops, rural electric co-ops, two of the bigger sectors, but they're common in, depending on where you are, in a lot of the other sectors too. So what we're doing at NCBA, to get to Chuck's two questions, what are we doing as an organization that touches on a rural agenda, and that touches on, in particular, a rural poverty agenda. As I mentioned, NCBA is now, we're 102 years old, so as we embarked on our second 100 years, our board, a terrifically diverse board of 25 cooperative leaders from across the sectors that I just talked about, engaged in a visioning process, asking themselves, what can NCBA inclusive do to make sure that co-ops can be an even greater force for good? Okay, so they started out that big, but very quickly got to asking the questions, what's at the very heart of the cooperative business model that can help answer some of the societal and economic questions that we face today. And after about a year of in-person and virtual, kind of visioning and research, they landed on really kind of, I'd say, going back to that core of creating economic opportunity for everybody. And about that time, we found a report that the Rockefeller Foundation had just released in the middle of December of 2016 that framed a vision of an economy that a lot of thought leaders, a lot of economists, a lot of other social scientists, and government public policy folks have been talking about, an inclusive economy, inclusive growth. But what Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner did, two academics on the West Coast, what they did was kind of bring together the last couple decades of how to think about an economy that really works better for everyone. And they called it inclusive economy. And they looked at 5 factors: participation, equity, sustainability, stability, and growth. Familiar factors to a sophisticated crew like you, also familiar factors to the cooperative leaders. Our board and our leadership, we looked at those 5 factors and we said, well, wait a second, that's what co-ops do. Co-ops are a strategy to get to a more inclusive economy. So fast forward, the board determined that as we look at the next 100 years, what we need to do as an organization is work with the cooperative community to make sure that the broader community, whether that's the research community, whether that's other thought leaders, the public policy community, to make sure that people understand the potential of the cooperative business model to build a more inclusive economy. And that, we think the timing's right. We think that by many metrics, which I won't go through right now, some of them were included in some of the, the PowerPoints before we got to come up here. We're in a moment of exclusion, of social and economic exclusion that really is comparable to, to some of the more serious moments in U.S. history in the past. And I'd submit, and then I'll stop talking, that when you think about, when people have looked to co-ops to really answer a big question, it's usually in a time when people feel like they're not part of the economy, they feel like they're not part of society. It's the turn of the 19th to the 20th century when half the population were still on farms, and suddenly the economy went to the industrial economy, and farmers found themselves literally with no access to market and very little bargaining power. And they looked to co-ops to answer that question. In the early 1930s, when people in cities, about 90% of them had access to electricity, only 10% of people on farms had access to electricity. They looked to the cooperative business model and an amazingly successful public-private partnership that continues today in the rural electric cooperative sector. So those are 2 examples. I could think of some more. And then I'm just going to touch on Chuck's second question on the research field and some of the questions that we're asking. We just recently announced NCBA and our 501c3 affiliate, the Cooperative Development Foundation, recently announced a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that is really asking the question, how do co-ops and how can co-ops build a more inclusive economy, build economy in communities that are more sustainable, more vibrant, create more economic opportunity. We're just starting that. One of the first papers we're doing 4 white papers, we'll look at what are those metrics that we should be looking at to answer that question. How do cooperatives help, build local health economies? So we can dig into that a little bit more, but I did want to raise that flag for folks here that might be interested in that work. I'd love to have further conversation, but I want to hand this off to Suzette. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. I'm Susanna Nardi. I am a vice president at LISC, which is Local Initiative Support Corporation. We're a national community development financial institution, CDFI. We have 31 urban offices and a national rural program, and I am blessed to head the national rural program. We are definitely lead with capacity building. We do that in urban sites, and we do that across this nation. Our urban sites pick select neighborhoods where they focus their resources and their energy and work with all of the community-based organizations or CDCs that work in those same neighborhoods. In the rural space, we work a little bit differently, of course, right? We're rural. We work with selected, identified community-based organizations across the nation. We work with 86 of them. We're in 44 states and over 2,000 rural counties. And the way that we work with them is we work with and through them. I view our role as a connector for our partners across the nation in whether it's financial resources, whether it's technical assistance, frankly, the cross-pollination of connecting them to each other and our network is probably the most powerful. At LISC, we're very much about community development and economic development. We touch economic development, we touch housing, community safety, health, education, and also building family wealth. Our new CEO, as of 18 months ago, has really elevated economic development as something that we really need to refine our tools, our capacity, and those of our partners, particularly in rural. So as we do that, in 2017 we invested $60 million in rural America with and through our partners in the form of grants, capacity building grants, healthy housing grants, cohesive economic development grants, loans, equity, low-income housing tax credits, new markets tax credits. But as we put together an economic development strategy, we asked several of our advisory committee members and some of our rural stakeholder peers to join us for a 2-day session. And we went through the usual data points, a lot of really smart, experienced folks in the room. And we landed on 3 strategies. The first one being workforce development and how we can do that better and more efficient in rural America. We also, ACT Plus, which is an addiction care and treatment initiative that we're launching. As I said earlier when Ann was here, we're leveraging our community facilities relending dollars to provide the physical development. We're leveraging technical assistance for our communities in all of the soft side of putting this type of initiative together. And then we're leveraging our community safety folks at the national level of LISC to provide the community, police, and medical engagement. Because we do see the addiction crisis as a real barrier to economic development. We also are taking one of our urban models, which is a financial opportunity center model that does have data-proven results. We've used it extensively in our urban sites, and now we're recreating it in a rural model that is a mobile model. And it really has three legs of the stool, so to speak. We stabilize a family when they come in and make sure that they are receiving all of the support that they need to stabilize their family within where they're at. So we meet them where they're at. We then bring in financial coaching and help them figure out their finances, for lack of a better term, and where they want to be, help them set goals. And lastly, bring in the workforce development, the job creation side of the equation to help them get to financial stability. And so as we do that, we come across this word called scale. And I really dislike that word as a rural practitioner because I feel like it's an urban word that they lay over everything that we want to do in rural. And they use the definition of scale in an urban way. And so our task force felt the same way. And so we talked about how do we combat when we're talking to public, private, philanthropic potential partners, how do we talk to them about scale in rural America in a way that they get it? I live in a town of 1,200. I get scale in rural America, and you know, what we really boiled down to, our question was, can we really talk about one job in rural America and use the same measurement as we talk about the development or the addition of one job in urban? And yet, our lens, when we are talking about it, we're held to that same, like they are the same. And I think about it pretty simple, so this is a simple alliteration. If you have a puddle and you throw a rock in it, the ripples go all the way to the edge. So that rock impacts everything in that puddle. If you have a lake and you throw a rock in it, it goes so far and then it stops. And so if we could quantify what one job in rural America, think the puddle model, if we could quantify that it really does reach every part of that rural community, and sometimes that rural region, in a way that we could get away from using urban terminology or urban measurements, what a different story and a tale we could tell about the importance of a job. And I'll just close with one more story. So I live in a town of 1,200. They got a CDBG grant. This intergovernmental, there were 6 local governments, they got a CDBG grant. There was a huge fight over where that one job was going to be to manage that CDBG grant. I was the fortunate one that got that job in Fowler, Colorado. It made tremendous difference to not only my family, but to that community, for us to have that one job in that program, which went from a $150,000 CDBG grant to a $10 million program that's still in existence today. So I would just challenge and ask that you think about that so that we can talk about rural jobs in a more realistic, rural way.
Thank you. And I'm Rosa Maria Castaneda with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And I'm hearing you speak, and I'm thinking, I hope I haven't been in any meetings and talking to rural potential grantees and asked about scale lately. I think we talked about it in hopefully more nuanced ways. Thank you for that lesson. I'm very happy to be here with you today and with this extremely distinguished panel. In our philanthropic investments, we have lifted up the incredible work of co-ops over the years, where a lot of the bright spots that we talk about in our work in rural America and lift up and highlight are the work of the long-standing, history and work of co-ops and the importance of asset building and people power in rural America. We've also been longtime partners of LISC for many years with an integrated service model and trying to learn about the tailoring of that model for rural America. So you've been great partners to us. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but we have a new partnership with NACO. So the Casey Foundation is one of the largest national foundations focused on children in this country, and We were founded by the founder of UPS a long time ago, and we are all about our come from into this, all of our work is the rates of rural child poverty. And Casey's interest in rural America comes from this lens, this perspective of how do we reduce the incredibly high rates of child poverty in rural America. So every year we run the numbers on child poverty and give it, the platform that it deserves, and spread this information through our Kids Count Network, which is an advocacy group in over 40 of the states across our advocacy groups, child advocacy and anti-poverty advocacy groups and research institutes all across the United States. We are a foundation that recognizes that children live in families, and so we take a whole family approach to understanding and reducing poverty, and we think about place, opportunity, and policy, and we organize ourselves that way. Place-based investments that focus on certain communities with anti-poverty strategies. Opportunity is learning about what are the most innovative approaches to building human capital, service integration, work and economic opportunity for families, and policy. And that's how we think about scale all across, but also in a rural setting. I'm actually going to refine how I think about scale when I have conversations with rural partners and grantees. We're a foundation that understands the connection between place, poverty, and policy, and that is, I think, particularly for rural America, that's a prerequisite to getting at more effective anti-poverty approaches. Because of in our work, because of the challenges in the economy and in the labor market in rural America, we also have worked very deliberately that connects economic development and workforce development to these inclusive approaches. That is a language that I'm glad to see you using. It's something that has been our lens all along, because you can't think about anti-poverty approaches in rural America without thinking about the context that you're in, which is deprivation around economic opportunity, and that you have to take a more collective approach to it. But right now, we have a lot of economic development work that is disconnected to the poverty conversation, disconnected to understanding a family, what helps family well-being, increasing family wages, social supports that families need in addition to work. So we've tried to highlight work that sits at the intersection of, say, entrepreneurship, the work that happens in co-ops, and economic development, but in an inclusive way that's actually lifting up families to reduce poverty in rural America. So that's something that we have long known and have tried to lift up. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what have been our areas of investment, and then I'm going to go to what are we interested in now and what I want to hear more about actually from you at this conference. I will say that one of our approaches has been the development of what's called the RUPRI network, Rural Family Economic Success Network, that runs out of Aspen Institute, and it's about lifting up those bright spots and giving a platform for rural leaders to talk about what's working in their communities and how they can learn from each other, because we noticed in our work that there weren't enough platforms for conversation about what's working. And there weren't enough places for rural leaders to, learn from each other. Now, NACO is a part of that platform, but we wanted to supplement that and connect it to the research base. We've also invested in two-generation strategies, because that's a theme of our work, and what our we what are two-generation strategies? It's more holistic, whole family approaches to poverty reduction, recognizing that children are not a barrier to work. We should think about supports for children alongside economic opportunity supports for families, simultaneous supports around early child development and human capital, skills building, and job opportunities for families. So think about that more holistically. And we were an investor and helped to inform the design of the former administration's work on rural impact, which we were so happy to see arise because it was an opportunity to connect the conversation around anti-poverty and strategies that work to anti-poverty in a rural place, and to learn about how to adapt family opportunity approaches to work in rural communities. So it was something that was a huge gap to fill, and it was wonderful for the administration to step up and lift up rural poverty as a major area of interest, and to pump money and support into innovation around it. And so thank you, Doug, for your leadership around that work as well. And I'll say a couple things that I care about deeply going forward and that have been on my mind. One is we have seen in just the last 2 years research that has highlighted the increase in concentrated poverty in rural America. That is a huge area of concern. And I would like to understand it better, know more what's shaping that. Some of this work came out of the Carsey Research Institute, but because we know of the lethal consequences of concentrated poverty, what it means in terms of child deprivation, what it means in terms of lack of economic opportunity for adults, that is something that I have been thinking about, is this rise in child poverty, but also rise in concentrated poverty, and more rural Americans living in places of concentrated poverty is something of deep concern. Another area that we have sponsored some work in is understanding that there's not one rural America. There are many rural Americas. We think of rural America as entirely homogenous, all looking the same and same characteristics. That's not the case. We also tend to identify rural America, especially of late, as very white, very Caucasian. That is not the case. If you think about the intersection of low-income rural communities, mostly located in the South, and those are places where you're in low-income rural America, it's much more likely to be people of color. And if you think about rural America, it's much more likely to be, as I said, in the South, where there is less of an investment in reducing child poverty and family well-being, more likely to be family poverty, higher rates of family poverty. So this intersection of race and place and policy is one that I'm very interested in seeing some more work around. I think a lot of the public conversation doesn't acknowledge this, and a lot of the media doesn't acknowledge this. So that's where I'd be interested to see some additional work to help us understand and lift up these inequities and highlight the full breadth of rural America. I've also mentioned our work in two-generation strategies. That's just a thematic frame for the foundation. And I will say that, because of the moment that we're in, and what's at stake in the policy conversation today, I'm most interested in research that connects the dots straight to policy, and that is timely vis-a-vis the most important policy issues, federal and state, that are are most influential in shaping that poverty that we're here to talk about at this conference. So I don't see enough platforms that I don't see enough research, places, platforms, institutes that connect those dots. And I know that that's what this conversation is about, but it's been a long frustration for us. And from a philanthropic perspective, where is that work? I need to fund and support work that understands the importance of a timely delivery of information, that lifts up the voices of rural leaders to bring up these issues of opportunity in their place. That is in part why we have invested in certain platforms, is to leverage the voices of rural America around anti-poverty strategies. And we cannot have these important conversations around healthcare and what's at stake in terms of supports that rural America relies on without the voice of rural America weighing in on how important that has been for their survival. So as we think about rural opportunity, we can't disconnect it from the policy debate and what's at stake. And if you want to be influential in terms of policy, you need to be timely around it. So we've invested in research around what you've learned about in some of this conference about the reliance on certain social supports and economic security and tax programs, and the importance of that to rural communities. But I think we need to see more of that. And I would say that as researchers, ways that you can draw those connections, organize yourself, think about being timely, use social media around it, and give voice to rural leaders who can speak about this. That's the work that I, as an investor, am particularly interested in. So I don't have the benefit of having been here with you for this conference. I regret that deeply. I want to hear what your takeaways are from this event. That's primarily what I'm here to do, is listen to your takeaways and your ideas about how you can connect the dots. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Amy, Casey, and Rosemary for partnering with Mako, and to Chuck and RUPRI. Chuck's been my mentor since 1997 on rural. I've been working on rural economic development since that time. He was the first person I met when I went to my previous job, and has really been a great mentor and friend. One of the things about being in this physical space that I hope you noticed is that it's the National League of Cities and the National Association of Counties coming together for a joint leadership center. And we do hear about local competition all the time between cities and counties, but what we're trying to do here nationally is really push our membership to think regionally and to think collaboratively, including with nonprofits, the private sector, philanthropy, and others, including universities. Let me talk real quick about counties and just give you a little landscape. So if we were a business, we'd be a $580 billion a year business with 3.6 million employees. 1% of Americans actually work for county government. And yet we're probably the most misunderstood level of government. We represent really the 40,000 elected officials. So there's 20,000 county commissioners and county elected executives, and about 20,000 constitutional officers, from sheriffs, district attorneys, clerks, assessors, public defenders, district attorneys, and others. When we look at our roles and responsibilities, we really cover domestic policy A to Z. And one of the challenges we have as creatures of the state is we have the same mandates regardless of our size. So there's 3,069 counties, parishes, and boroughs. About 50% of the American population lives in about 150 of those. So the other 50% of the American population lives in around another 2,900 counties, including about 80% of our counties being defined as rural. So we have real big challenges. Los Angeles County, our largest member, has 10 million people in the county, a $30 billion a year annual budget, and 110,000 employees. They're the same size as North Carolina or the state of Georgia. They'd be the 7th largest state. They have the exact same mandates as Loving County, Texas, with about 150 people. And yes, they are all related. So it tends to be a wealthier county with oil and gas. But when you look at our focus, we're really focused on infrastructure, community infrastructure, And as our president, who is supposed to be here yesterday, talks about, we are focused on physical infrastructure, bricks and mortar, as well as human infrastructure. And really that physical infrastructure is just a tool for us to deal with our residents and other folks in our communities. So when we look at rural America and the poverty, what we're really trying to do is create networks of networks where we understand the county governments in these rural communities will never have the resources by themselves to meet all their needs. So transportation is one of our big responsibilities. We own 45% of the roads in this country, 40% of the bridges, a third of the airports, and we contribute to about 78% of public transit systems. You take Grant County, Oklahoma, 4,500 people, a classic rural agricultural community. The county owns 960 bridges. If you want to adopt one, they will gladly work with you. But a county of 4,500 people can't keep those 960 bridges, including about 400 that meet federal aid eligible standards. It can't keep investing in them and maintain their jail and run the elections and do public health all by themselves. And they have real strict, detailed responsibilities. So the philosophy that we're pushing to our members are, how do we innovate in a space where counties are under the thumb of the federal government and federal funding sources and states who are increasingly restricting our revenue? We have 44 states that the legislatures have imposed very stringent revenue restrictions on us, particularly with property tax. And I had a county executive say to me one time, and she was a former newscaster, she said, you know, the problem is in the private sector we celebrate innovation, and in the public sector we investigate it. So how do you get folks, particularly in the human service world, to get out of a compliance mode when every hometown newspaper and blogger would love to criticize them for thinking outside the box? Elected officials are not incentivized to think outside the box. Their job is to reduce risk. That's how you get reelected. So what we're trying to do, and a lot of our team members are here and working with Annie Casey, is look at how can we really push some thought leadership out there, and we're finding counties across the country are really trying. The one thing I would disagree with you is on the, this is really minor, is the two-generation approach. It's really multi-generational. It's really 3 generations, because it's the grandparents, the parents, and the children. And this year we launched a big initiative on early childhood education, particularly 0 to 3. And why did we do that? Well, one, there's a huge gap in that service. It's really expensive. Nobody wants to take care of kids with diapers and that aren't potty trained. They want to wait till they're 3, 4, 5 years old and then get them ready. How we started thinking about this was actually through our jails. When a county starts to look at, do we have enough jail space? Are we overcrowded? What do we need to do with our facilities? One of the things consultants look at is 2nd and 5th grade reading levels to predict out what the jail population will be in the future. That's a really sad indicator. Now, that's not the sole indicator, but it's one of many things that they look at. And as we started to think about it, kindergarten is too late. And all the research that Annie Casey and others have shown over the years shows if you start school with such a big gap in your word deficit, you really never catch up. Certainly there are individuals, but in the aggregate, most folks don't catch up. And so we started to think about how could counties really tackle this through our own assets. We own thousands of libraries. We own thousands of parks and different rec facilities. And the last place we want to deal with people is through the juvenile justice system or the adult criminal justice system. We may use it as a tool to divert people into behavioral health services or other services, but that's just a part of the funnel, and we want to get way ahead of it. And what we've been finding is so much of the excitement around early childhood is our rural communities. We had a county commissioner recently speak from Utah, and I'm going to forget the name of the county, forgive me, but it's like 1,200 people. And they're sheep farmers. That's what the county does, sheep farming. And if you could listen to this county commissioner talk about the pain that the community is suffering from the folks they do educate leaving and them being left with those that really are challenged. Not that they don't want to invest in those that are challenged, but they just feel like they're a training ground for the urban areas. And they're losing their family members. So it doesn't matter if you're LA County or a small county, they're all focused on the poverty issue. And counties historically have dealt with the backside of poverty. We are dealing with the consequences of poverty. And I want to wrap up with the opioid crisis. Everybody knows about it. It's killing more folks now than car accidents. It's the #1 source of accidental death in the country now is overdose, primarily because of fentanyl, which is being laced into heroin, etc. These are actually Chinese and Mexican cartels that are doing this to us. It's actually a slow death approach. Purdue Pharma is a family-owned company that went from about $1 billion in assets to $15 billion in assets in the last 10 years. They own the patent to oxycodone. Meanwhile, county governments have spent billions, as well as the society. What are our touch points just with an overdose? Well, we run the 911 system in this country. So our 911 systems are overloaded. When you call 911, we dispatch a sheriff's deputy or one of our firefighters or EMS. When you get sent to the jail, we own the jail. If you get sick in the jail, we have to pay because once you're arrested, not convicted, you lose Medicaid or your veterans benefits. Not at arrest, not a conviction, but at arrest. If you're a typical opioid user with hepatitis C and you need medication, it costs us about $100,000 a year to medicate you. If you're in our jail and you need a liver transplant and you want to be in the jail because you need a liver transplant, it costs us about $800,000 to pay for that. Federal government doesn't pay, state doesn't pay, we pay. If you overdose and die, our coroners have to prosecute, they have to process you. That costs about $5,000. If you need a toxicology report, it's $2,500. And if you're indigent, we actually have to pay for your burial. When I say we, those are local property tax owners. Our child protective service caseloads are up. Our foster care caseloads are way up. In Ohio, it's not unusual for the county foster care and rural to be up 300%. And then the last thing is very interesting is our jails were not built for females, they were built for males. And our female jail population is now going up substantially, meaning we have to retrofit our actual facilities because there are certain laws that you can't commingle those populations. So the costs go on and on and on for just that one epidemic, let alone the things that we've dealt with for decades with rural poverty, whether you're in the Delta, tribal areas, Appalachia, etc. So I could keep going on there, but this is front and center for us. One, it's draining the coffers of local property taxpayers through their county government. We can't keep up with the demand. And we see, as Rosemarie was saying, a have and a have-not world, where these rural counties are the ones facing more of the challenges and have fewer and fewer resources.
Let me make 2 points before we do Q&A. I wish we had another hour and a half, Rosa. First point is, these folks are friends. They're going to be here after this session. They don't want to go away from you. They want to align with you. We are going to try to make a structure for that to occur with the help, with the support of Annie Casey and with Matt and his staff's connection. We're going to pull together a small collaboratory of rural poverty researchers and align them with some of the models in county government that are looking at unique program design so that we start to lift up some case study opportunity and build a cadre of researchers that are thinking about the immediacy and the urgency of having public policy research in place when a decision is made. That has been RUPRI's effort for 30 years. We could have used one hell of a lot more philanthropic and public money. Part of the challenge we all have is, how do we we get sufficient funding to do this. I think we're gonna have to build a federation to do it. I think a research collaborative nationally around rural poverty would be a great model. I think the pool or the pond, Suzanne, is the best metaphor I've heard in a long time. Why aren't our regional economists quantifying the impact of one job in a pool as opposed to a lake? Let's do that. And lastly, to have a local leader like Matt is truly amazing. I think you realize why these people are up here. We have about 20 minutes. Let's ask as many questions as we can and try to get quick answers. But these folks are not going away from you. They will be in the future. So let's just start. Quick questions and let's take it around. Matt?
Well, to think of the question, I want to add one point that we really could use help from the research community. Chuck and I, years ago, tried to build a rural resiliency index before the word resilience was even hip.
Yeah, we were hip back then, man.
And one of the challenges, we knew the framework. We knew to look at food nutrition subsidies in schools, voting records, traditional poverty, housing statistics. The challenge was rural data. And one thing I would offer to the researchers is NACO self-funded and built something called the County Explorer. We've got a team of data experts led by Amelia Estrade who built a 600 data set website for our members to think about evidence-based and data-driven decision making. Some of them are public data sets, some of them we purchased, and some of them we actually built ourselves. We actually built our own data set of the number of endangered species in every county, for example, because it wasn't there. One, use the website. It gets about 1 million users a year, including all over the world. But two, help us think about how we can synthesize that data and really help our elected officials make more informed decisions. The challenge with rural, of course, is that the data isn't always there. It's there for the urban areas, but the rural data is either lagging, way behind. Is that Tom Johnson back there?
Yeah.
Wow. Tom actually was the guru of that.
He was indeed.
Great to see it. But anyways, look at it and talk to us about how we can use it. And for the first time ever, we took a bold step to actually put in a benchmarking tool where our counties can actually benchmark themselves against each other. That's not something a membership organization typically does, but our members were willing to do it.
Thanks, Matt. Questions? Let's go. Sam, 2 or 3. Let's take 2 questions at once and get as much as we can. Go ahead, please, Mark.
Thanks, Ann, I'm sorry. Rosa, I just wanted, I have a book with Dan Rickman that, just a quick point that actually shows that, and for obvious reasons, the impact of job growth on child poverty is greater than the impact of job growth on adult poverty, just to get at your point. You know, I have questions for all of you, but for Doug, I have two quick questions. And one is on rural policy around the world. When I go around the world, including the United States, is the people are very disappointed. I'm talking about academics who research it and use evidence. Very disappointed with rural policy around the world, including the United States, for decades. And one of the questions is that, well, it's generally at the central government, at the federal level. It's generally handled in an agricultural ministry who focuses on agriculture, you know, across the world. And, you know, if rural, it's just left out, even though that's 95% of the population. And then the next comment I have is quick, is I love your model on cooperatives. However, I did a study once on Canada. They have much more cooperatives up there. And we beat the data to death. And we found nothing on community outcomes. And some of it could be, you know, why would that be the case? How could cooperatives step up? So as quick as I could.
No, that's great, Mark. Let's answer that one. We'll get the mic up here. Please, responses.
You respond to that?
Yeah, please. Let's
I've heard about that work, and I want to see that work. We want to see that work in a very big way at the beginning here. On your first point, I was involved. Chuck actually got me involved even before I was with the prior administration with the OECD, and you know that group of rural development ministries. And you're right, most of them are in the ag ministry, and I think you know why the public realm does have a hard time on innovating and catching up to, you know, the reality on the ground, more so than the private sector. I think that's true actually with with the organization of the federal government and the way that it treats rural, actually. You know, the way that rural got attention historically was it came through agriculture. It was the power of the agriculture, you know, sector that knew how important rural was, and so it's brought into that, you know, that agency. It really varies, you know, all over the place, and it does cause, I think, a big challenge sometimes for policymakers, not only in the executive, but certainly you look at, you know, ag committees and, you know, other committees like that where, you know, there's certainly some great champions in all of those places, but it's an organizational challenge.
I just want to say that Doug O'Brien was chair of the working group in OECD, and the White House Rural Council, which he chaired, was a major driver in addressing that issue, Mark, over the last 4 years of the Obama administration. We, in fact, co-hosted an international OECD conference in Memphis about those very issues, so we should all express a debt of gratitude to Doug for that. Sam, and then Ann.
Matt mentioned the Rural Resiliency Index creation. Just picking up on that as an example, I would like to ask each of the panelists to give us, this community, this research community, your 1, 2, maybe even 3, things that you would most like to see from us. That could be the answer to a specific research question. It could be helping create some database. It could be helping to translate. It could be any one of a number of things. So what is the 1, 2, or 3 things that comes to each of your mind?
What's been wild to me is we've been polling our members on their #1 issue. And consistently in the last 2 years, affordable and safe housing has been #1. That's not even a county responsibility. We always hear jails, bridges, airports, that kind of stuff. And for the last 18 months to 2 years, affordable and safe housing. And why is it that rural America's housing stock is either unsafe, unaffordable, not in a condition that's livable? It's been very interesting for us because that's typically a city type view, and it continues to come up from our Rural Action Caucus ahead of broadband now, which has been interesting.
I'm not going to answer that question because I think there is some fascinating rural work, and you've been talking about what that, you know, areas of attention should be. From the philanthropic perspective, my frustration is that tremendous research doesn't see the light of day. Doesn't get to policymakers, doesn't get to influencers, doesn't get to media, and I think that's why I said organize yourselves, platforms connected to policy, be timely, connect to research institutes that are smart about getting to the media and getting in the public conversation. So it's the route of the research to having an influence that I care most about from a philanthropic perspective.
So I've been at the National Rural Housing Coalition board meetings this morning and yesterday, and so at the risk of sounding like a broken record, you know, the rural job versus the urban job, but as I heard about the housing, I also realized that, you know, if we could come up with a baseline of 5 indicators that we could research, like what is the value of one homeownership unit in rural America, a rural community versus urban, because all of the things we talk about, housing, education, all of that, the impact is different in rural. And so if we could come up with a community toolkit that said, these are 5 barometers that you need to understand in order to improve your community. I am not a researcher, so this is going to sound really Pollyanna, but if there was some way that, I mean, as Rosa said, if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. But there are some commonalities. So if we could come up with 5 or 7 baseline indicators that a community could use data that's available and some kind of factor so that they could benchmark themselves against other communities or really look at turning their negatives into positives. In other words, what is our score here, and help them prioritize, that would be amazing.
So two quick responses to build on both what Rosemarie and Susanna talked about. First is that Rosemarie has really emphasized today on making sure that the research gets the light of day. Just a 1-minute anecdote on why, like an example of that. In the fall of 2015, I was working at USDA as the acting undersecretary, and I came across Kids Count just on I don't even know how, to be honest with you. It was on a listserv. It might have been a RUPRI newsletter. I'm not sure where it was. Yeah, Rufus newsletter. That's right, the Rufus newsletter. And it really struck me. I mean, I knew these numbers, but the way it was presented was very compelling in terms of rural child poverty numbers and some trend numbers. I sent that on to Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, and said, I think this, and I didn't send him very much. He got a lot of stuff, right? The Secretary of State of Purdue, they get a lot of stuff, so you're really choosy about what you send him. And this was definitely worthy of something like that. He's going to be interested in this. Fast forward, within 2 months and 2 conversations with President Obama, and Tom Vilsack was serving as the chair of the White House Rural Council at that time, and he determined that for the remainder, 2016 or 2015 and 16 of the administration, that the focus would be on rural child poverty, and there was no doubt about it. It was those data, and some of that data, frankly, over time, it's not the most innovative data. It wasn't like brand new data sets or anything like that. It was just presented away at the right time that it could really, pierce that bubble. So that's just an anecdote on how things can really matter. On what are we looking for in terms of the research? Right, to your question, Sam, and I'll repeat a little bit what I said before. I mean, what we would love to come up with in the cooperative community, and I'll push back on my first questioner a little bit now that I'm not quite that mentally quick, of course I'm going to say this, but I'm almost certain that the cooperative business model in the right circumstances, used in the right way, make a bigger difference in community in terms of wealth, in terms of participation, in terms of equity, in terms of sustainability and stability. I mean, I'll take a non-rural example. You look at what happened during the housing crisis with cooperative financial institutions, also known as credit unions, versus non-credit unions, and the foreclosure rate was well above 3 times for non-credit unions, and there's a lot of reasons under that. But you would talk about stability. That's just like one little thing, and certainly we can talk about wealth and who gets to own things when you talk about the cooperative business model. But if we could come out, in the next year or two, on a small set of indicators that show how a particular business model, an ownership model, can really make a difference in community, and then we can start to really move and accelerate action on that. That's what I'd be looking for. So.
Can I just make
Please.
one last comment? The importance of data. So when I started my nonprofit, as I shared, I had a $150,000 CDBG grant to do rehab. I went and did research. I even hesitate, I'm going to put that in quotes, because I went to the county courthouse and I figured out the average age or the age of all the homes that were in my small rural county of 10,000. 87% of those homes were over 30 years old. I think it was 72% of them were 2-bedroom, 1-bath. I built a $10 million revolving loan fund based on turning that negative into a positive through a rehab program. That's the kind of data points that communities need in order to make a difference in their housing or any of their other needs.
We have time for one more, Ann, please.
This is more of a comment than a question. And first of all, I want to say how much I really appreciate this panel. I thought it was really interesting, really stimulating, and exactly what we all need to hear. But I wanted to specifically comment on your Suzanne's critique of scale. I can't tell you how much I appreciate hearing that. It's probably the first time I have ever heard somebody implied that there was anything problematic about bringing, using scale as a criteria for everything. And I think especially in rural America and rural anything, we have to be very careful about what is scalable and what isn't, and what kinds of models we use, and whether they, whether we should be held to some sort of judgment about whether it actually scales, whatever that actually means. So thank you, I appreciate it.
My response to that is we need to do a lot more deep quantitative work to broaden that understanding. I think the metaphor needs quantified. I think it's wonderful. Let me close with a couple of appreciations. First of all, there are a set of us whose life's work was to make research more relevant to public policy at its intersection. And RUPRI has probably failed in that regard rather miserably. If I've heard one thing over my lifetime, I've heard it 100 times. Why isn't there a Brookings for rural? It's about $50 million a year that philanthropy provides to Brookings. And I want to reinforce how important NEFA is to the rural research community. We would not be here today without that infrastructure. And Rosemaria, we really wish we could do more. But it's important to say the federal government has done an amazing job of quietly sustaining all of our efforts together. Secondly, I want to say this leadership community cares about rural America. And not only do we thank them for their time, but you can communicate them in the future, please do. These are dynamic, visionary leaders. Can we express our appreciation to this panel, please? Finally, would you get the staff in here, Bruce?
Hey, Chuck.
Please,
One
Matt,
comment
sure.
for researchers, so we have the audience. I think there's two key points. Is one, in rural America, we really need to be careful, I think, about focusing just on jobs and forgetting wealth. Because the rural jobs of the future are probably low wage and not really sustainable jobs. And if there's one thing we learned in rural America is that global and national companies will come in and use rural assets and resources and bring the wealth back to the urban areas and leave the rural landscape scarred environmentally and typically left behind as far as economic benefit. So when we talk about the rural economy, we have to talk about wealth creation. And it makes people very nervous. But you're seeing it in agriculture where most of the farmers now don't own the land. It's somebody in an urban area that leases it back to them, that their family sold it, etc. And the second thing is, today is like Christmas on Capitol Hill. It's like a mini stimulus that was just approved or will be approved in the next couple of days. It's absolutely wild to watch the flow of money coming out of this town. And much of it is going to be targeted at rural, whether it's in timber-based communities, manufacturing, technology. They even put $2 billion in there for child care block grants, and to watch the billions of dollars that will be targeted from opiate treatment, et cetera. And I think it's a real opportunity to rural to, one, get it from the states, which will be our top challenge, is not to make sure it doesn't stay in state capitals, but flows to the communities, but that we really make strategic evidence-based decisions that have a real good value on our return.
Let me add that that's definitely an ad for the rural wealth creation framework that RUPRI is working under. You heard the poster session. We've moved all of our work in all the sectors to rural wealth creation in a comprehensive way. We think that has great opportunity to really change the discussion. Finally, I want to say the partnership with NACO has been one of RUPRI's greatest advantages over the years. I think this venue was simply phenomenal. We couldn't have afforded it without these partnerships. I'd like all the NACO staff and the RUPRI staff to stand up. Let's express great appreciation to these folks. Let's thank our panel again. Thank you so much for being with us.
So I'd like to invite up Ann Tickmeyer and Mark Partridge for our next and closing session. While they're coming up here, as you guys know, this conference was to learn about what kind of research has been done, but also to think about the foundation for the research agenda going forward. And as I was trying to, and you guys want to maybe just sit here, I'm going to pass the mic down, and we'll have to move. Yeah, we'll have to move for them. And as a lot of the research that's been done in this room and elsewhere on rural poverty has been done by economists in regional science and rural sociologists. And as I was trying to think about who would be the best people to close out this conference with their reflections on both the work that's here and what they know is going on as a foundation for our research agenda, I settled on Ann Teckemeyer and Mark Partridge, both of whom have written books on rural poverty, both of whom are the editors of their premier journals in their field. And I thought that what I asked them to do was to think about reflecting on what they know about the research agenda, where would they head, and how can they guide us in starting to produce the research agenda that we would like to produce. And so, Mark, I'll start with you because you've got a PowerPoint.
Yes, I have a PowerPoint, because we all want one more PowerPoint. And it's coming up here, yes. So I made a quick PowerPoint with some thoughts of mine, and go to the next slide. The first point I wanted to make was this really captured my attention. We were talking about classification issues, and I just wanted to point out that it really matters how you define rural. So the black line's average U.S. population growth. The blue line here is non-metro if you used the 1950 definition. And what you would, and then basically metro would be, the reverse. If non-metro is above the average, metro is going to be below average. My point is, the point of that is that if you want to define rural as non-metro in 1950, we have a success story. It's a success story. Rural is doing really well in that sense. So my point is that it's not like rural is a complete wasteland at all. It is just that we keep reclassifying the winners, the so-called winners, to metro, and what's left is places that are slower growing. And so consistently, if you use the 1973 definition, the 83, and so on, it keeps getting lower and lower and lower. And actually, they're taking out of non-metro counties that are on average growing faster than the U.S. average. So I just want to make that point in the sense that rural is not some sort of wasteland that's hopeless. If you define it in a way like, hey, going back to 1950, wow, it's a success story. Next slide, two slides up. So the next point I wanted to quickly make is that, this is a point I was making when I asked Doug O'Brien the question. This shows the percent of jobs in rural, non-metropolitan area. And what I wanted to notice is this is something that frustrates me, is the policy, rural policy often gets confused with agricultural policy. And this top line shows non-metropolitan rural America. And right now it's under 6% of the jobs are actually in agriculture, leaving 94% elsewhere. And the point is that, the reason why I'm stressing that is I think this audience knows that. However, it's always a long-running battle. I've been doing this since nearly 30 years, and that's a long-running battle. So next slide. Okay, so now what I was going to say, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. This has been really fun. I've been doing this, like I said, for a long time, and I was just so enthusiastic to see everything. And fortunately for you, I had a migraine this morning and had to take my medication out. So you had more questions. But this is a book that I co-authored with Dan Rickman. The Geography of American Poverty is a Need for Place-Based Policies. Came out in 2006. Next slide. Next slide. It was based on a proposal we wrote to the Upjohn Institute in 2002. It was right after the red-hot labor market in the 1990s. Unemployment rates
dropped below 4% and consistently stayed in that range, you know, for a few years. So the labor market really heated up, and it was the first time since 1973 that the poverty rate started falling. You know, even in economic expansions in the 1980s, it rose. And so I was really excited. Well, you know, tight labor markets, we can really make a dent on poverty. And unfortunately, the context is that I've changed, as I'll describe, I've changed my thoughts on that. The 1996 welfare reform was aimed at getting people to work. Well, that's okay in a red-hot economy, but for the most of the time, it hasn't been a red-hot economy, and it hasn't been particularly effective. It's been effective getting people off welfare, but not effective in helping low-income households. So in our policy recommendations in the book were place-based policies. And for example, we proposed, this is something that Larry Summers and Edward Glazier just proposed as well. We proposed in our 2006 book making the earned income tax credit region specific. In other words, in certain high poverty clusters, increase it, hence encouraging more work and so forth. I'm a little bit, I still think that should be done, but I'm not as optimistic that that would have the kind of success that I would have thought then. And that is that I think a lot of the problem, technological change and so on, skill bias, technological change and so on, is that it's a labor demand issue. It's not so much a labor supply issue. It isn't like these lazy people are out of the labor force. Or a lot of other reasons why they're out of the labor force is there's just no opportunities out there. Next slide. Next slide. Oh yeah. Okay, so basically low-income households are facing all sorts of winds. International trade favors high-skilled workers. Falling real value of the minimum wage since the late 1960s. It'd be much higher when it peaked in 1968 in real terms. Declining unionization and declining bargaining power for workers in general. Technological change has really hit, especially these have all hit low income. They're facing all these winds. I mean, and so likewise. So when we talk about education, I worry. Yeah, education is the best anti-poverty program there is, and also training. However, the problem is with it is I'm increasingly concerned with increases in income inequality. Those at the bottom are earning so little that, and they view this as, why should I spend time or invest my own resources that are rising over time, and the cost of college and so forth. Why should I invest in that when I can end up pulling a job here at the lower end of the tail? Well, it's a very, very risky investment for somebody who has very little resources. And so, yes, more support for education, but I have fears that not only does it take time, politicians can't look past the next election, but also on the supply side, the people who would receive it, there's reasons why they are kind of reluctant to do that. And so all in all, I view this as really a political economy failure. All of these things could have been affected by political economy decisions. For example, Europe, even though they've had the euro disaster, disastrous currency and so forth, they haven't experienced the kind of income inequality and increases that we have. It's really showing these institutions matter. So what are some policy solutions? I come around, so I said where I changed my optimistic 2006 book is I come around to what Tim Bartik said in his 2001 book, which is a classic. He recommended we're going to need public employment. We're going to need public employment because especially in areas, rural areas or other declining Rust Belt cities and so on, it's a labor demand issue. The only way that we're going to get people with the skills and experience working is through public employment. And that seems like blasphemy today. However, that was very common from the New Deal through the Carter administration in the late 1970s. This was quite common practice. And Tim shows in his book programs like CETA, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, which I remember in high school, all these young adults working for federally provided jobs. And there's certainly a great need for these. It's not like there's not enough social needs out there, as Bruce Weber noted, Dr. Kenneth Galbraith's book. The public is suffering, the public sector is suffering while there's so much private wealth. And certainly any kind of federal hiring would start tightening up the role of skilled labor market, increasing wages with positive benefits like that. However, that's kind of viewed as communism today. However, we have a long history of that and a successful history. Next slide. Okay. Likewise, I've come around to saying that these noted socialists, Milton Friedman and Richard Nixon, were right, that we do need a basic income increasingly. I don't know, I know there's, as others have noted, there's work disincentive effects and so on. However, with the kind of forces facing low-skilled Americans, I don't see how to get around that. And so, like I said, if Richard Nixon could go to China and propose a basic income, we can do it. And next slide. Okay, so I am really pleased. This is something as an economist, and also sociologists face the same thing. If you look at space, you do spatial things, you look at places, you're kind of viewed as like a weirdo. In economics, aren't you really an economist? You're just a geographer who does numbers? What are you? And I'm really glad to see, like this was a really, a lot of spatial things. What really matters if we're talking about reservations in Montana and North Dakota versus large cities. The place matters, and local governments matter. And indeed, as we heard about county governments, I do a lot of work with Linda LaBelle, and we focus on county governments. They're they employ more than any other government level, and yet there's no research on it. It's like they literally are completely ignored. And one of the things that we found is, with some evidence suggesting, because this gets at the resource issue the counties face, it's not so much the policies they're doing, it's more of the competence and capacity they have. In other words, yeah, good policy is better than bad policy, but if you have incompetence, administering good policy, it's going to be incompetently administered. And so resources really do matter. Governance really matters. So local governments matter, industrial composition matter. As I pointed out in the question, children are the ones that actually get the benefits even more than the adults do, and so forth. Okay, next slide. So we talked about, why does poverty cluster? How can we address these issues of poverty in spatial clusters like Central Appalachia, Mississippi Delta, so on, the Black Belt? And one of the things that Dan Rickman and I found is this is not necessarily the case. In fact, a lot of economists say this is probably not the case, is that we found that job growth in these poverty clusters had a much higher impact in reducing poverty than on average. And one of the reasons why economists may be skeptical of such a thing is their notion is, well, these are people that self-selected to live in a poverty trap. They don't want to work. They self-selected to live there. And so, that kind of a finding is useful. Now, we didn't find, that's a great finding, how to create those jobs. Does it pass benefit cost analysis, those kind of things, but, they're optimistic. And, so more work at I was really pleased to see, people looking at that, like, slavery and its impacts that last today, and those institutional things are really important. Next slide. Okay, so real quick, because I know Bruce is getting antsy. I just wanted to note that some of the recent work I did is something we published, Rural America in the Trump era. This just shows the standard deviation, and I know the chart's not really scaled right, but this shows the standard deviation of per capita income across the US. And what I want to note is it's gone up by about 50%. Not 50 percentage points, but 50% since the late 1970s. The point was we were converging, all becoming more alike, all the way up until the 1970s, and now we're becoming more apart. And since the Great Recession, the same kind of pattern on employment growth, it's really varying. Point is that places are having very different economic outcomes. There's reasons to believe there are places left behind. More so today than 30 years ago. We're doing that. Next slide. Okay, one quick little point. The kind of things I think that research can find is the economy is really changing. In that sense, I have a really good understanding of the economy in 1999. That's not very helpful today. So this shows poverty rates, red's bad, green's good. On the average, the annual change in poverty, 2000-2007, Western US doing great. Look at the Rust Belt and Central Appalachia not doing real well, but generally the West doing really well. Next slide. This shows the annual change 10 to 17 minus 2000, 2007. So, basically relative, who's now doing better compared to the way they were before the recession. And what I want to note, this is general pattern as we go on since the late 1970s, the West is increasing poverty rates. However, despite all the news stories in the New York Times and so on, relatively, the Rust Belt's actually performing a little better in terms of poverty. In other words, I don't say the Rust Belt's booming, but it's not declining at the rate that it was. So, in the next slide, I won't go through this. Employment growth is the same story, pre-recession. The New York Times articles of today are correct. Next slide. But post-recession, the Rust Belt's coming. The point is that a lot of the popular wisdom out there doesn't really actually apply. The need for research. That people hold these myths, and even though the data for several years now saying otherwise. Next slide. Won't do that. Same thing with median household income. Next slide. Okay, future research last. Identify the roles of the governments. Which one should they play? I've already said that. In terms of labor supply initiatives, great place-based policy might be wonderful. I've advocated for it, but is it all it really do is rearrange where the poor people are? In other words, we didn't really do anything. That needs some more research. And what kind of training programs, like apprenticeship, technical college, and so on. So, Bruce, I covered it all.
Thank you, Mark. I might start by pointing out I did not ask for a presentation. Mark has given us both a very thoughtful and a data-based set of ideas about going forward with research, for which I'd like to thank him. And so that's partly to set up. Anne does not have a PowerPoint because she basically followed instructions and
I don't have a PowerPoint. I thought about it actually, and then I thought, oh, by being basically the last person on the program, we're probably all getting to the point of being, death by PowerPoint. So I am going to talk. I wonder what happened to the podium. Oh well. So I was asked to sum up what we've heard and learned over the course of the conference. And first, I'd like to say how stimulating and how really interesting this has all been. I didn't hear a bad presentation. I heard a lot of really interesting, thought-provoking things. So this has been a great couple of days, as I think everybody has said. I was also asked to use what we've learned as a springboard for how to go forward. So I'm going to try to do that. First, the good news. The evidence from the conference is that research relevant to rural poverty is alive and well. It's moving along. It's a robust enterprise. And to some extent, there are some little bright spots in terms of rural poverty itself. Especially on the first day, we heard about reductions and, there's a lot of flatlining and all that kind of stuff. But compared to when the commission issued its report, things have definitely gotten somewhat better. That's the good news. Now I've got lots of bad news. The sort of bottom line of the bad news is that the more things have changed, the more they've stayed the same. It's cliche, but it's really, really true, I think, in this case. It's true of the Commission's findings and much of the research enterprise since. Most of the Commission's findings could be restated today, and in fact, some of the presentations did just that. The paper by Tim and Brian and Leif quoted one of the Commission's statements. Let's see. The Commission's goal to achieve the elimination of underemployment and low income of rural people remains an unmet aspiration and a continuing obstacle to rural economic well-being. So despite all the progress in learning about the demography and the geography and the economics of rural areas and some improvement, so many of the conclusions, so much of the Commission's report could be written today. You'd have to change the numbers, but the interpretations would stay exactly this, or very much the same. Similarly, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on poverty this semester after a very long hiatus in teaching of anything. There is life after administration. And I really struggled to not to be demoralized or even worse, to discourage my students. These are all bright young scholars, and we come in with all the doom and gloom. I mean, our reading lists are basically all the stuff that you all have been writing and all the people that you have been citing. It's been a real struggle to avoid having the knowledge of how little has changed in the last several decades, not, sort of color the learning experience. We're still slogging through many of the same research and policy issues, and it's especially sobering, I think, to learn how little the wealth of research findings seem to translate into good and effective policy. We've heard that from a number of people today, from both the researchers and the policy and practitioners. But somehow or other, no matter how good our research is, it doesn't get heard. It doesn't have the impact that it ought to have. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but why isn't, with all the interest and emphasis on evidence-based policy, why is it that our research doesn't have a bigger dent in things? We still hear the same things about the deserving and the undeserving poor. I mean, the people may not actually use that term, although every now and then they do, but that's what underlies so much of policy now. I think it was Lisa who said that work requirements are wildly popular, and those are basically the sticks that somehow we must make those lazy poor people earn their benefits. There's this underlying assumption that is held by the public for sure and policymakers that somehow poor people remain lazy and shiftless and unwilling to do what it takes to pull themselves out of poverty. This has been the sort of popular assumption for many decades now, and it just doesn't go away. And it's discouraging to be faced with it on a daily basis, and it's discouraging to talk to students about it. Also, the failure to recognize the diversity among rural poor peoples and places. We've heard a lot about that today, and our previous panel pointed to that, and yet somehow or other we keep when I say we, I mean the public at large, or policymakers, or whoever, a collective we keep forgetting that it is a diverse audience out there, and that we need to take that into account. And also, something that's a little bit different in terms of that I think is discouraging, but there's sort of an effort, I don't think it's explicit, but it sort of underlies a lot of research to create a competitive notion of whose poverty is really worse and whose needs most attention. Is rural or I was about to blur the words. Is it rural poverty? Is it urban poverty? Increasingly, we're hearing about suburban poverty and the rise of suburban poverty and how truly terrible that is for all reasons. Well, it's all bad, and it's all connected, which is something that the commission recognized, and somehow we keep losing sight of that rural and urban and now suburban and whatever other geographical distinctions we want to make are connected, and that you're not going to be able to get a handle on any kind of poverty unless we get handles on all of the poverty, obviously including rural poverty. Basically, I guess, while I'm so impressed, and I'm a little bit self-serving, having dabbled in poverty research myself, our efforts are great. I really think they're wonderful. But the policy discussions have not followed the research or kept pace with it. So somehow there's this huge disconnect between research and policy that hinders the effectiveness of going forward. So what do we do then to go forward? What should our agenda be? What hope is there for truly addressing rural poverty? So when I started this, I had, 4 or 5, maybe 6 different points. And then the more I thought about it, and the more I worked on it, the list kept growing and growing and growing and differentiating, and now I have this huge laundry list which I will not bore you with. I will be happy to share it with anybody who's interested, but I have tried to boil it back down to about 6 or 7 points. So first of all, I think, and some of this, there's nothing new, there's nothing I'm saying that hasn't been said today or yesterday during this conference, but hopefully it helps us coalesce our thinking. The first is the links across space, which follows in the critique of whose poverty is worse. The Commission's report on the people left behind very smartly recognize and stress the connections between rural and urban poverty. It's really important not to siloize rural poverty. Now, we often feel aggrieved because we're put in a silo. Somehow we're the other. But we need to hang on to what those connections are. We need to do comparative work, obviously, but we also need to think about how they are intimately interconnected. So I think that's really important. The whole the policy and public opinion piece. All this great research, as I said. As I said, I'm teaching a graduate seminar, and they're reading all the stuff that you all have written and that your colleagues have written. And you know what? The one article that everybody went crazy over was a policy studies piece about, it was called Framing the Poor, Media Coverage in U.S. Policy, 1960 to 2008. And basically it traces the connection over time between how the media frames poverty and policy. And there's a very, very strong correlation. Now you could argue about the directions of causality and all that kind of stuff, but the point is that we don't do enough to try to figure out why is it that the public, all those policymakers, maybe some of us, have all these misconceptions about poverty and cannot somehow use the good research that we do to make better policy. So we need more research on what it is that makes people think about poverty and poor people like they do. Now, you can make arguments about some of our misconceptions and underlying beliefs are not just age old, centuries old. Nevertheless, that's an area that we need to do research, and we don't do much of it. And I don't think anybody does a lot of it. The links between macro and micro outcomes, all this great stuff from sort of 20,000 feet perspective on the demography and the geography of poverty. I mean, I am a huge fan of that kind of research, but we haven't heard a whole lot about how that connects to mid-level social institutions and organizations, and then down to behavior. We've heard a few things. The middle piece on education was great. We've heard all of this stuff about child poverty, but where was the family in all this? I mean, children just don't spring, full blown out of nothing. They're part of a social organization and a social institution known as the family, as well as education, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. How can we connect all that great structural level work with what the outcomes are? What happens at the individual level? It's not. I know that kind of research is taking place. I wish there had been more of it here. But 2 days, you can't have everything. We've had some good examples. I know there are a lot of others. That actually brings up the whole issue of cultural issues, and I don't mean culture of poverty, but all the talk after the last election was the importance, actually through many election cycles, about the importance of religion on people's voting behavior and their attitudes and beliefs and stuff like that. As a sociologist, very few of us actually study this stuff, and yet this is a huge influence on public opinion. I don't think any economist studies it. Maybe I'm wrong, but what is it that frames people's beliefs, and so where are those cultural connections that are so important? We have some practitioners here among us, like Jen Sherman, who does study that kind of stuff, but we need more of it. I'll skip to we need more qualitative and mixed methods research. There wasn't that much of it here. I wish there had been more. That is a lot of the kind of research that brings that 20,000 foot perspective down to what actually happens on the ground. So that would be something that should inform our research agenda, and it shouldn't be a second-class citizen. I mean, this is rigorous research that really helps us fill in understanding of what happens from the structural arrangements down to how it gets translated into reality. And we need more of it. But it's hard to do. I mean, I started out as a totally quantitative researcher, and one of the things I have learned over the years is, and back in my day, among sociology grad students, quantitative work is so hard, blah, blah, blah. When you teach, it was, that's the easy stuff. The qualitative work is the hard. I mean, the kind of time and effort and understanding and whatever that has to go into, and it needs money. It can't all be done on a shoestring. Diversity, I think Rosa Maria talked about that. Continuing to remember and to probe the diversity of rural peoples and places, whether it's by race and ethnicity. We heard a lot about that. That's really commendable. It's really important. It's all part of the legacy of rural poverty in this country. But we need to also hear about other kinds of diversity, about gender, about sexuality, about certainly immigration. I mean, we need, probably most importantly, to look at the intersections of all those. Now, our data won't always support that. That's a huge problem. Gets us back to the methods and data issue. But to the best of our ability, we need to look at how these different factors that are also important. We know immigration is important. We know ethnicity and race are important. We know gender is important. How do they all intersect? And that's really an important part of the agenda. And, back to I already said the qualitative and mixed methods. Also the need to look at new data sources. I mean, we're all being sort of overwhelmed by the advent of big data, sometimes pretty negatively as in the headlines right now. But, these are data that we can use and mine, and we need to figure out how to do it, especially as some of our old tried and true methods are failing us. The old phone surveys don't work anymore. Some of our most basic methods of collecting data are just increasingly expensive and increasingly unreliable. So we need to think about where to go from there. So efforts to grapple with new sources of data and ways to collect it. And then this comes to the laundry list, and I'm not going to go through it, but what is the future? When I was talking to my students about, what should our agendas be, and they're talking about artificial intelligence and, all this kind of stuff. Well, obviously this is going to have impacts on poverty, and we need to get ahead of the curve in understanding how this is going to work, especially for rural areas, which tend to get left behind on new technologies. So all of these need to become part of our research agenda. I think I can summarize that the bottom line is there are many bright spots on the horizon connecting current and future research agendas. There's no dearth of both continuing and new work out there, but a lot more needs to happen, and the urgency is finding a better way to connect our research findings with policy, whatever the specific topic is. Thank you. Oh, can I just say one thing? Since Mark put in a plug for his book, I want to put in a plug for ours. I should have had a picture. Rural Poverty in the United States, Columbia University Press, that came out last summer. Jen Sherman and I and an economist from Purdue, Jennifer Warlick, not Purdue, Notre Dame, excuse me, one of those Midwestern states. I'm a Midwesterner, so it's okay. Are the editors, and a lot of people who have been in this room are contributors to it, or colleagues of yours that were contributors to it. And if I say so myself, it's a really good overview of rural poverty.
was gonna ask, you offered perhaps to share the list. So so this is exactly what I had hoped would happen. I mean, I give Mark a hard time about the PowerPoint, but I encourage you to look at the PowerPoint, to look at the ideas that are not just the graphs and the maps, which are in themselves interesting, but to look at the ideas that are there, and then Ann's ideas as we start to think about what the next step is. Now, we've got about 10 minutes for questions and or comments or thoughts about the next agenda that you may have had in your own
So Tom Hertz from ERS, as you were talking about the connection between rural poverty and urban poverty. So in the past, I think that was people leaving the farms, coming as poor or skilled people to the cities and creating the urban underclass. And then you're talking about it, now we have suburban poverty to worry about too. Well, it occurs to me that now, I don't think that urban to rural migration looks that way anymore. I think it's more the high skilled people looking for jobs. But an interesting connection that just suddenly popped in mind is, how about this displacement from urban areas to suburban areas by rising housing prices, by gentrification? And can you document that how much of suburban poverty is being driven by that exodus out of the inner city to the suburbs, and sort of show, are we gaining in a negative way, gaining more suburban poverty than we're reducing urban poverty through the gentrification process? Is there sort of a net loss in income by this dislocation? It seems like I don't know, just an idea I thought I'd throw out there is, you can look at how housing prices have changed, or develop a measure of gentrification in metro areas, and look at the poverty outcomes in the outlying suburbs around them.
Let me just say one thing, and maybe Mark wants to say too, but I think that's a really good point, and it also goes back to something that Mark and I think Dan Lichter said the other day about, a lot of rural areas have grown out of poverty because they're no longer rural, they've become metro. I'm not sure that's a definition of success. I mean, maybe that poverty has just been transferred to the exurbs of the metro areas, and so it's a more complicated picture.
Anne, if you don't mind, I'll summarize the current, much of the current state of policy, and I'll get to address the comment is that it doesn't suck enough to be poor, and children need to learn how to pick better parents. And I think I summarized a lot of policy. There's actually, one of the problems with doing, I just want to quickly say that's a really hot area of research. In fact, I had a graduate student write a paper on it, and here's the problem with it, is that all of this is endogenous. Where the gentrification takes place and all this, does it take place in places that you think it's going to grow faster anyway? Or is it taking place in places that are disaster where prices are low? But it's all endogenous, and so to get around, that's the big hurdle to get around that because that is an area that people are looking at. I'm not one of them, but.
Hi, so two quick thoughts. One, just on the deserving and undeserving poor. I think those of us who do qualitative work and talk with low-income folks know that they might be the first to say, to draw those distinctions in their own places, and they themselves don't necessarily want more government programs coming into their small towns. So those of us who are left-leaning academics who want more government programs, maybe that's not what the folks themselves want. They want other sorts of dignity and better jobs and things like that. So this isn't directed to anyone in particular, but if we want to take seriously the voices of people in these communities, we should think about that when we think about our policy responses. The second thing is that I'd love to be part of any ongoing efforts to think about how to break through to policymakers. So I spent 7 years lobbying in DC before going back to grad school, and so for those of us who did policy stuff, I mean, even though I thought of myself as pretty informed, but that's not what my job was to keep up with, like, what obscure reports or academic journal articles. I mean, I couldn't have gotten behind the paywalls anyway, right? So we were taking, at the very most, like policy reports from Brookings or other places, and running up to the Hill and trying to convince folks of things we already sort of believe because of our constituents and the people we are lobbying for. And so I just think, there are ways to break through, but it's not just going to happen. There, policymakers and difference makers in DC are not going to find us and like really want to know what we're up to. So I think some people in here do a good job. Some individual academics like take it on themselves and build relationships on the Hill or with organizations in DC that have access, and I know some do state level work in here. But I think there's some people doing effective work and translating their academic findings into policy pretty effectively. So I think we can think more about that. But I think some of it's not just going to happen. And you need champions on the Hill, you need champions off the Hill, you need people to translate the work for you sometimes. And sometimes you take it on yourself to build those relationships with individual offices. And be in DC, be in members' offices and find the champions in the House and in the Senate who are going to care about what you're doing and check in with you. So I think there are ways to do it, but we should be thinking more about.
Can I just follow up? One of my points that I didn't say is kind of consistent is I think there's a little bit of the labor economics literature and a little bit, but it's not really comprehensive. What are the costs to society of poverty? So in other words, you may think those people don't deserve help. However, if you could put it, this is costing you, and this is really costing you. And I think, to get at your point, I think that would help as well.
Yeah, I will say, the ROI stuff I think is important, and the long-term costs, although I do remember if you're a budget committee member or appropriator, it's great to say that you'll save Medicaid money 20 years from now because you're investing in kids today, but that's not how the federal budget works, and so you can't really you can't get that cost savings 20 years from now in the budget that just, the omnibus that just passed. The CBO doesn't score things that way, so I think it's also just knowing some of the reality of how things, like what happens on the Hill, and the sort of the calculations that members have to make when they make decisions about what they're voting for or not. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that sort of long run stuff.
Well, it's not long run, I'm talking about current costs, and it's not just the federal making the decision.
And there's also the silos between things, like Medicaid, like you could say investing in housing saves Medicaid money, but that's not how the budget works.
I think Chuck said it really well. We need a Brookings or an Urban Institute or something. So we need that kind of. RUPRI is one of it. NACO, but they're on a smaller scale. We need some sort of organization or institution that can speak for us to those policymakers. The academics aren't going to be able to do it. First of all, the whole reward structure, the whole institution mitigates against being that spokesperson. We're not trained to be it, but we need those intermediary organizations that can be the policy institutes that speak for, that translate this research into policy.
Yeah, on that, I think that's right, and in the long run, it'd be great to have that. I think in the shorter run, like you just said, we should break down silos about whose poverty is worse. So there's definitely groups working on poverty in DC, and so maybe instead of creating our own rural poverty policy shop, we can just make sure that there's a person with rural lens next to the other poverty people when they're going up to the Hill and doing their thing.
I remember what happened when welfare reform came, and there was this flurry of research, and every now and then somebody said, oh, we need some rural research, and so somebody would hire somebody from the Urban Institute who had no knowledge or understanding of rural anything to do some sort of report. So we need a presence with more muscle.
Yeah. There's time for a couple more questions. Let's get 3 more questions, and then we're good.
So as the person who's receiving the lobbying, right? Albeit only 2 months that I've been there, I think we do need really good, rigorous data. We also need the personal narratives. And if you combine those, I think it's effective. So, as you do mixed method research, you do it to inform really good quantitative data, but also those are the stories, bring those in as well. And then I want to say, I think collaborations between different people with different expertise, and I have worked with an urban, awesome group, even though they're urban, they do care about children and SHIP, but I'm saying is, I think there's collaborations we can do, and given that we're at a weird time right now, I think we're dealing with a lot of natural experiments, taking advantage of those, and there is huge amount of grant funding. I want to just reiterate what Matt had said. It is coming this year, and we need to you guys all have preliminary data. Move in there and get together with other people to take advantage of it and make it better for everyone.
I just want to offer a quick observation. I think the response was perfect. You have to be there every day in every way. You have to understand the committee and its people. You have to understand the constituents that lobby. None of us can do that in one place. We've worked with a lot of sectors to build a collaborative model. Rural health care advocacy in this country has been able to integrate research centers and build a constituency for public policy advocacy across individual researchers through a set of policy research centers funded by the Office of Rural Health Policy. I think what we're starting to think about, to Ann's point, how do we build a loose federation where our individual work can be aggregated, articulated, and personalized to a district and a member? Long-term goal, if we could do that, we'd make a difference in getting the work more relevant. I think it's possible.
So we have one more question. Looks like we got a question.
That was a perfect thing to say to segue into what I wanted to say, because I am one of those health policy researchers funded by the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy. And so my observation about the work over the last couple of days is that while it was all really interesting and illuminating to people who already care, I found myself wondering in most of the cases where the policy variable was. And I feel like the research really needs to hone in on what's the policy variable and to pivot off of that and to say whatever it is, if it's tax levels, subsidy levels, grant funding, communities that did or didn't have a certain intervention at a certain point in time. I mean, when we do rural health policy work, one of the most common things we look at is levels of Medicaid eligibility. And so that's a policy variable, and that has a very concrete meaning to a policymaker. And so if you have results that hinge upon it, that is a direct line into them understanding what they could decide to do about it. So that's my comment.
So there was one more question in the back. If it's a short question, we can take it. Great. Okay. A comment, we can take it. No response.
So I was really excited to hear one of your 7 points, Ann, to be the incorporation of qualitative and mixed methods research, because I think on top of your comment, for those of us that are practicing on the ground and working with community leaders who are implementing these programs and needing this research, a lot of times we don't know how to digest and spit out what that research is, so we need your help on that. And not to say that we are dumb in that way, but we just, our brains think in a different way. And so what I would encourage is not necessarily waiting until you have your results and the research is complete to say, okay, who can this apply to? But from the beginning, when you have a question come to mind and you're beginning to build your team, reach out to the federal agencies, state agencies, local government, county and municipal government, and put it on our radar, especially those of us who have networks like a national association, but also federal agencies, state agencies that have a network of leaders, that if your research is on our radar, we have our ears open to when we're having conversations with our local community leaders. And if we hear those issues arising on the local level, we can connect you and your research to those opportunities for qualitative and case studies to build into your research. And that way it's already applied, right? So it already has that application and that relevance, rather than doing it after the fact. And I'm not saying, I mean, some of you may, I don't know, but it sounds like there's that opportunity to loop the policy and practice in from the get-go.
It's funny, I'm teaching a research methods course, and you're describing action research. You're telling us that that's what we need to do a lot more of. Yeah.
I
I just want a quick comment on the policy. One of the real problems of doing a policy, because I mentioned before, I did a lot of work on counties, is measuring policy and actually reporting. A lot of it's a data issue. There would be a lot of work done on specific policies if we had a common uniform way of a database collecting that. And so and then the other issue I just wanted to say is that researchers face is the issue of endogeneity. You know, policy is in response to problems, so what's causing what? And so, you know, that's always one of the problems of trying to do that kind of work. But yeah, there would be a lot more work if there was more data on that. In terms of qualitative, I just real quick qualitative comment is I like it because my research is really quantitative, and you know, I can tell you general patterns, but I don't get in there how things work. The one concern I have about qualitative is external validity. You know, does it apply to other places? Which is like that's the problem I always face in quantitative research, but the same with qualitative. If I do something in Mississippi, I may not get the same outcome in Oregon because it's a different context. So.
Great. So I'd like you to join me in thanking this panel for a very kind I'm going to get you out of here by 3 o'clock. 2 points. One, Chuck has mentioned, and we've talked about how important the support of NIFA and NEKC and NACO was for this conference. What hasn't been mentioned as much I'd like to bring is the support of the poverty centers. Institute for Research on Poverty and the director Lonnie Berger, UK Center for Poverty Research and Jim Ziliak, and Stanford's David Grusky were critical in helping design the conference and in supporting it, both financially and intellectually. And we worked with them and with our who were part of our National Advisory Council, and two of both Tim Slack and Jen Sherman were part of our design team as well. And so I'm grateful to them, all of them, for their help. In a recent focus from IRP, Rebecca Blank, who's now Chancellor of Wisconsin, reflected on the 50 years of IRP's work and talked about the contribution that they made. And I'd like to just summarize the contribution that she thinks IRP made, and then challenge us to attempt to replicate that in the rural space. Becky Blank said there were 3 contributions by IRP. It created a cadre of researchers and nurtured new scholars in rural poverty. It helped make poverty and social policy research interdisciplinary, and finally it maintained strong links to the policy world. All of those 3 things were critical to IRP's success. What I'd like to suggest is that RUPRI and RPRC have been inspired by a similar vision, and that we have made a much more modest, but in the same direction, kind of a contribution to rural poverty research and policy. And then going forward, and this is my last point, I hope that you will be involved with us, with RUPRI, and with the collaborative of the poverty centers in moving forward, maintaining and building a sort of a place-focused, policy-directed research agenda for the future. I thank you for your participation. Safe travels, and please keep in touch as we move forward on this agenda.
Yeah, take care. Travel safely.
Let me stop the recording first.